give you all a moment to sit down. It is now 10 after 10. So it is time to begin. So our next session is devoted to Walt's famous study, America, Russia, and the Cold War. This is a book that came out in multiple editions. It was the basis of training for, I think, legions of undergraduates around the United States and around the world. In that sense, it might be his most widely read book, although it's perhaps hard to say. And so Frank Costigliola, class of 1972, one of Walt's graduate students, and Jeffrey Engel, class of 95, one of Walt's undergraduates. They're going to reflect upon America, Russia, and the Cold War.
Well, thank you. Actually, is this too loud? No? Okay. All right. Actually, I got my degree. It's officially listed as 1973, but I really finished in 4 years with Walt in 1972. And the reason it's listed as 73 is I turned in my dissertation the day I moved to take up a position at the University of Rhode Island, and I copied the dissertation in the wrong kind of paper. It wasn't copied on this silk bond paper, so they didn't accept the dissertation. So it's a year later. But I just also want to say that I'm writing a biography of Walt, or trying to write a biography of Walt. So if you have letters, emails, memories, please contact me. Okay. America, Russia, and the Cold War offers insight into not only the U.S. foreign relations history, but also into Walt himself. Appearing from 1967 to 2008, the 10 editions of the book highlight the continuity and the changes in what Walt judged as important over those 4 decades. Space in this book was tightly limited. In the preface to the first edition, Walt emphasized the difficulty of fitting his analysis of 1945-66 into the 259 pages allotted by the publisher. The passage of time only tightened the squeeze. The first edition allotted 12 pages per year of history. In subsequent editions, the book expanded to far beyond, dealing with much more than America and Russia, really the whole world. And by the 10th edition, the book had expanded, although the book had expanded to 450 pages, from 259 to 450 pages, the book now allowed only 7 pages per year of history. The later editions actually packed more words onto each page, and even the paper grew thinner. With real estate so scarce then, it was telling what Walt detailed and what he cut short or deleted from the book. In other words, the 10 editions of this book sketch a trajectory of Walt's intellectual autobiography. Walt started thinking about what became America, Russia, and the Cold War around 1962-63. He wrote Lloyd Gardner that he was eager to move on from the 19th century in order to understand the central crisis of the time, namely the Cold War. Although Walt's scholarship would later dip back into the 18th and 19th centuries, as he wrote on Central America, Japan, and other areas, he would remain focused on the more recent past. Lefebvre wrote contemporary history because he was fascinated and to some degree also horrified by the unfolding disasters of American empire. He believed that historians were obligated to help head off, or at least to illuminate, the follies of imperial ventures. In this mission, Walt identified himself. Indeed, he prided himself as carrying forward the tradition of Charles Beard, Carl Becker, and the other progressive historians. Even as Lefebvre pruned other topics from the book, he kept intact through all 10 editions a lengthy homage to Beard, whom he lauded as the greatest of those historians who had emphasized class divisions and had applauded reform. Lefebvre championed even Beard's last and most controversial book, President Roosevelt and the Coming of the War, published in 1948. To the outrage of many historians at the time, in 1948, Beard had criticized FDR as an imperial president, who had flouted the Constitution and had defied the wishes of most of the American people in order to take the United States into World War II. As Lefebvre laid it out, on one side of the ledger were the good guys, and that's probably a little too exaggerated, the better guys. Beard, James Madison, the writers of the Federalist Papers, and the upholders of the Constitution. They all stood for rational argument, careful judgment, and caution in international affairs. Arrayed against them, again, this is quoted from Walt, arrayed against them were most American historians who wanted to be fashionable. Lefebvre singled out as leading this establishment camp, quote, Samuel Eliot Morrison, Boston Brahmin, Rear Admiral appointed by Roosevelt, and president of the American Historical Association. Supporting this elitist pro-Roosevelt and pro-imperial majority was Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who positioned liberals, Walt wrote, who positioned liberals not to the left, where Beard wanted them to be, but in the vital center. Lefebvre's delineation of this battle and his clear identification with the Beardians reflected deep intellectual loyalties. It was almost, I think, a matter of rival family clans. Against Morrison, Schlesinger, and their East Coast alma mater, Harvard University, stood Beard, Fred Harvey Harrington, William Appleman Williams, and the pride of the Midwest, the University of Wisconsin. And then in 1956, when Walt began graduate school, the Wisconsin History Department remained conspicuously loyal to the legacy of Beard. Going to Madison, Walt turned down a fellowship from Harvard. He would later remember that decision as one of the wisest he had ever made, and he said that on more than one occasion. The Madison years influenced Walt's lifelong perspective and the intellectual context of America, Russia, and the Cold War. It didn't determine it, but influenced it. When the first edition of the book appeared in 1967, it was greeted as a pioneering, revisionist, anti-establishment account, indeed a serious challenge to American historians. Writing in the American Historical Review, Bart Bernstein, himself a rising revisionist star, made a perceptive criticism. While Lefebvre had, in Beardian tradition, emphasized the importance of America's quest for an open door, at the onset of the Cold War, Lefebvre had largely dropped that emphasis in subsequent chapters of the book. That split between the earliest and the later chapters of the book would become more pronounced in later editions. What Walt remained consistent about, however, was the Beardian skepticism, amplified by Harrington and Williams, of undemocratic decision-making and of imperial ventures. With regard to Vietnam, Cuba, Iraq, and other U.S. interventions, Lefebvre offered a critique, though as sharp, though measured. Indeed, part of Lefebvre's genius as a writer and as a lecturer was his deftness in expressing dismay in a manner both forceful and restrained. Walt used irony to powerful effect. This brings us, of course, to Reinhold Niebuhr. Niebuhr's The Irony of American History provides much of the intellectual scaffolding for America, Russia, and the Cold War. Indeed, the bumper sticker storyline of the book comes straight out of Niebuhr. Emerging from World War II as the most powerful nation in history, the United States spent decades dissipating its power in unwise foreign adventures while neglecting mounting problems at home. Niebuhr warned that the unsurpassed power of the United States could lead to excessive confidence, then to engagement in unwinnable conflicts, and ultimately to weakness. The incongruity of strength engendering weakness was akin to comedy, Niebuhr noted, and indeed the elements of comedy is never completely eliminated from irony. All this made sense to Lefebvre, both I think personally as well as professionally. Lefebvre, who infused his writings and lectures with both irony and humor. That was their strength. Lefebvre shared Niebuhr's concern with overweening power and with the need for countervailing force. This is what James Madison had laid out in Federalist 10. Acutely aware of the importance of balance, Niebuhr, like Madison and like Lefebvre, stressed both the need for political limitations on the marketplace and the need also for the limits of such regulation. The single most telling fact about Lefebvre's 40-year odyssey with America, Russia, and the Cold War is that he concluded every edition, no matter the particular contemporary context, whether it was 1967, 75, 84, and so forth and so on, up to 2008, concluded every edition in the same way with Niebuhr's warning against excessive power and endless war. In fact, in the last edition of the book, Lefebvre has Gorbachev, he calls Gorbachev Niebuhrian in terms of Gorbachev's warning of the United States against too much excessive power after the end of the Cold War. In writing contemporary history, Walt lacked access to most of the archival record. He compensated by mastering the secondary literature and memoirs, of course, and later by searching the internet. Information also flowed in from Walt's unique network of contacts. After decades of teaching courses packed with Cornell students already fascinated by world affairs or sucked in by the force of his teaching, Lefebvre operated at the nexus of a web of experts at the top ranks of American society, including the top ranks of the US government. More than memories of Bailey Hall lectures sustained these valued relationships. A dedicated correspondent, Walt wrote long, single-spaced letters and later emails to a wide variety of acquaintances and friends. Here was the dedicated professor giving substance to the often hollow chestnut that teaching complemented scholarship. For members of this community, people in this room certainly, Walt's passing came as a shock. How could he really be gone? How could we ever get along without his ready wit and wise advice? For many of us, WWWS, what would Walt say? Or WWWD, what would Walt do? Has been a touchstone for our lives, both professional and personal. A symptom of this resistance to accepting Walt's passing was an urban legend that I heard from several people. Walt had kept a detailed diary. Walt had written a memoir. In other words, we might still access that fount of wisdom and good cheer. Unfortunately, however, there is no apparent evidence of any such journal or memoir, unless, Sandy, you can vouch otherwise. No. So, just an urban legend, unfortunately. Nevertheless, some pages of America, Russia, and the Cold War do speak to our current crises. Lefebvre remained committed to diplomacy and to compromise in international disputes. As Sandy Lefebvre recently recalled, quote, Walt always had great interest in and thoughtful, rational ideas about possible solutions for overwhelming situations. I will conclude with some brief mention of Walt's ideas pertaining to Eastern Europe and to the Israeli-Arab dispute from the book. In the tradition of Charles Beard, Lefebvre analyzed the expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe as resulting not only from US military and political aspiration and from Eastern European insecurity, but also from economic ambition. He detailed the profits from weapon sales to new customers by Boeing, Lockheed, and Raytheon, how those corporations had lobbied Congress to approve expansion of NATO, and how they had funded a lavish party celebrating the extension of the alliance. Concerned about Russia's hostility toward this latest American frontier, Lefebvre took pains to highlight a now forgotten, seemingly promising compromise. He wrote that in late 2001, Putin visited the United States, feasted on catfish and cornbread at President George W. Bush's ranch, and helped work out what Lefebvre praised as a historic deal regarding NATO. Expansion would go forward, but for the first time since 1949, Russia would participate formally in discussions on political, though not military, matters. In every edition of the book, Walt dedicated scarce space to detailing the conflict between Israel and its Arab neighbors and the Palestinians, while narrating these battles in a studiously non-judgmental tone. And I looked carefully at all those citations of this subject in America, Russia, and the Cold War, and also in the American Age, and Walt is really non-judgmental with regard to both sides. Lefebvre, while narrating these in non-judgmental tone, Lefebvre also endorsed U.S. efforts to broker a peaceful settlement that would satisfy both the Arabs and the Israelis. Though critical of much of the foreign policy of President Jimmy Carter, Walt praised the 1978 triumph at Camp David, where for 13 nerve-wracking days, Carter helped Begin and Sadat hammer out an agreement that ended the 30-year war between Israel and Egypt. That was Carter's proudest moment as president, Walt wrote. On another occasion, Walt criticized Hamas because of its pledge to destroy Israel. He noted that this radical group had come to power through open elections. That illustrated that, I'm quoting Walt here, that illustrated that the policy of pushing for democracy in the Middle East was proving to be even more difficult and dangerous for George W. Bush than it had been for Woodrow Wilson. Lefebvre opposed displays of anti-Semitism, strongly opposed displays of anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, especially in the United States. He counted Jewish Americans as among his closest friends. He also, in the last edition of the book, veered away from foreign relations analysis to dedicate 2 full paragraphs to celebrating the assimilation in the United States of Muslim immigrants. He wrote, nearly 3/5 of them had already become U.S. citizens, and they were better educated and earned more than the average American worker. And then he also listed some of their occupations, a little kind of veering away from the usual analysis. After the trauma of 9/11, Walt was singled out by Cornell University to address a memorial service on the Arts Quad. Gathered there were some 12,000 Cornellians, possibly the largest number ever assembled on the Arts Quad. Walt solemnly invoked the warnings of the founders of this country that a republic cannot be both ignorant and free. This insight means that we cannot be both ignorant of other peoples and be free, that we cannot be intolerant of great cultures and races with which we share a shrinking planet and remain free, and that we cannot surrender centuries-old constitutional principles, especially in checks on each branch of the government, and remain free. My time is up, but let me add a caveat. Even as I try to pin down the influences that shaped Walt and shaped America, Russia, in the Cold War, I am aware of how much I fall short. Walt was always more multifaceted than it appeared. He was incredibly open and accessible, and yet, in many ways, a very private person. While he remained a Beardian critic, he also became a pillar of the Cornell establishment. He evolved into the moral authority that helped save Cornell in 1969, and that Cornell turned to after 9/11. These were responsibilities, in a way, positions of power that Walt both welcomed and never felt totally comfortable with. While we can lay out categories for understanding Walt, the fit is never, I believe, perfect. His complexity transcended labels. Though assuredly friendly, generous, and brilliant, he defied easy classification. With him, the whole amounted to more than the sum of the parts. And therein, I believe, lies a clue to the greatness that was Walter Lefebvre. Thank you.
Let me just add in brief that this demonstration of division of labor represented the writing of this piece as well, which is to say, I highly encourage you, if you have the opportunity, to co-author with Frank Costigliola, because essentially it would go like this. I would receive 20, 25 pages in my inbox. I would then work for the next week to make them good and cut them down, at which point I would send it back to Frank, only to receive the next day 25 entirely new pages on a different topic.
But that's because I learned so much from you.
Well, there is that. And of course, there is the other important thing when you co-author with Frank, which is learning to cut out most of the Kennan references. So there we go. But it was a wonderful experience. And I am reminded that Walt told me in 1993 I should go meet this guy named Costigliola. I was too shy to at the time, but I'm glad I subsequently did.
So am I.
Thank you. And I'll invite questions from the audience or comments about America, Russia, and the Cold War and what the book has meant to you over the years.
I'll sit over there. I'll just do it with standard.
I'm Bob Einhorn, class of '69, undergraduate with Walt. When you take on conventional wisdom about the origins of 19th century American expansion, you may stir up a controversy among the community of professional historians. When you take on conventional wisdom about the origins of the Cold War, I think that's a different kettle of fish altogether. And I wonder if you could comment the extent of the controversy generated by this book on the origins of the Cold War, how it affected Walt's reputation within the community of historians and more broadly.
No, go ahead. You thought about this more?
Yeah. Okay. So the book was published in 1967, and I think it's on the rising tide of the increasing acceptance and reputation of what's called revisionist history. You know, obviously, 1967, the Vietnam War was certainly prominent, and the book came out. It's kind of one of those things that came out at the right time. I think if the book had come out a few years earlier, it would have met much more criticism. The reviews in the American Historical Review and the Journal of American History are both positive. As I said, one American Historical Review was written by Bart Bernstein, who, as Andy Rodder knows, was himself a revisionist. The review in the Journal of American History was written by George Herring, who was more of a middle-of-the-road person at that point. But still, people recognized that Walt had a powerful argument, that he had assembled convincing evidence. It's remarkable when you look at the footnotes of that 1967 book, the things that he pulled. It was like, James Burns' memoir. I mean, there was stuff that today historians don't look at because there's much better documentation. And yet his interpretation of those years largely has held up over the years. So I would say that the book was overwhelmingly positively received, and it helped cement or solidify Walt's reputation as a leading figure in the field. It's really the first comprehensive revisionist account of the origins of the Cold War.
But I would add that the book is a commercial success and goes through multiple editions, double-digit editions. And by the time it ran its course, I think the argumentative, innovative nature of a revisionist argument had become widely accepted. So it was far less controversial by the 1990s than it was in '67.
Jonathan Gelman, government major in 1970. I wonder, I'd like to follow up on that. In the 1990s and that last decade of the book's editions, was there any dialogue or reflections by Walter Lieber on the more recent writings of John Lewis Gaddis on the Cold War and on Kennan as well?
Well, this is a gathering of Walt's spirit of comedy and good cheer and trying to look at the positive side of everything. So it's a way of saying I think Walt was quite critical of John Gaddis.
I have a funny story about that. So I had a postdoctoral fellowship at Yale that began September 1st, 2001. And the important part about that date is not what happened subsequently, but what happened previously, which was that John Gaddis had been on leave for the entire year. So Paul Kennedy hired me. And when I first met John Gaddis, he wasn't happy. He actually said to me in the first, and he's since subsequently become a good friend, great guy. He said, "Who made a mistake and let somebody from the University of Wisconsin into my program?" So I freaked out, as one does, and drove to Ithaca and said, "I gotta have lunch with Walt." And he simply said, "You can learn from everybody, and you can work with anybody, and that no matter how much we disagree, he has a good spirit of mentorship as well," which turned out to be true. And I would attest to that greatly. I would also add that after that 5 minutes of discussion of personal problems, we of course turned to a discussion of the fate of the world, And I assure you, this was, I think, September 9th, 2001. I assure you the word terrorism did not come up in our conversation. I mean, I use that as an example for my students that, these two great intellectual theorists of the international relations system really had no idea what was going to happen and what was on the radar.
I have a different question, but I will just say, I think in our first seminar with Walt, we read Gaddis. I mean, so he engaged intellectually with it and had us engage intellectually with it. So I remember that. Anyway, my question is actually about Niebuhr and maybe some of the people in the room. So I remember an amazing lecture in 314 about Niebuhr and Becker and the origins of the Cold War. And I don't remember, I haven't reread America, Russia, and the Cold War. I don't remember if Becker stays in there or not. But if it first does it, and does anybody else remember this sort of juxtaposition of these two thinkers who he so admired? I shamelessly pirate that lecture to give it still to this day to my undergrads, and they find it fascinating.
So Niebuhr and Becker?
Yeah.
Well, Walt wrote I think it's for the Cornellian or the Cornell Alumni Review, wrote an essay called Cornell University and Carl Becker or something like that. And it's interesting because Walt there analyzed Becker. Becker is at Cornell from 1917 to 1941. And Becker was opposed to American entry into World War II. And Lefebvre in that essay, because Becker's kind of like a god at Cornell. Lefebvre in that essay talked about how wonderful Becker was and so forth. And then he has a phrase in there, at a turning point in history, Becker did not make the necessary turn. Because Becker continued to oppose basically Roosevelt's efforts to bring the United States into the war by one means or another. And because Becker was against that kind of exercise of presidential power. And then Lefebvre then brings in Niebuhr, because Niebuhr did recognize, Niebuhr believed that where there's evil, almost absolute evil, you have to oppose it in a forceful kind of a way, although that opposition to evil can also itself get out of hand. So Walt was able to use Becker and Niebuhr there to make that turn to say that, with basically kind of in a way revision of Beard in a way, that Niebuhr was right, and Niebuhr was the right theorist to bring the United States through World War II and into the early Cold War.
I would add, actually, there was an interesting moment in the authoring of this chapter. I think it was Niebuhr. If I'm wrong, don't correct me. This kind of conference and this book obviously has a natural tendency towards hagiography, and that the great man can do no wrong. And it was, I think, enlightening to both of us when we went back and forth, I think on a point that Walt made in the book about Niebuhr, back and forth saying, what the hell is he saying? And we finally came to the conclusion that it made no sense. And
neither of us could figure it out. We thought we were too dumb to figure it out, but neither of us could figure it out.
Each of us individually said, well, maybe I'm not smart enough to figure it out. And then we conferred and said, well, if we both are not smart enough, maybe the sentence at least should have been rewritten. So it was just a good example, I think, of how we have our heroes on our pedestal.
But it's the only sentence in the book that didn't make sense.
Well, to you.
Yeah, right. There you go. See?
Hi, I'm Eric Alterman, 1982. I meant to ask this question at the first session, but it wasn't worth extending the session for my question. But it's something I want us to see if we can keep in mind for the rest of our sessions. It came up because I realized, on a personal note, I emulated Lefebvre's career without understanding it until after he died, which is what Walt did, if you think about it, is that he took contemporary controversies and he explained to people how they happened historically. He did that over and over. He did it Panama Canal, Central America, the Clash, Michael Jordan even. And I have done, actually with my books, the same thing, although not nearly as well, I promise you, from a historical standpoint. Walt blurbed, to my great thrill. My first book and my 11th book. My 11th book is a history of presidential lying that I decided to write, you'll be shocked to hear, at the beginning of 2017. I don't know why I chose that year. And I knew that presidential lying had been inspired by the need for expansionism on the part of every president ever, really. In Walt's American Age, I believe he coined the phrase expand or die being the American credo. But the second thing I learned in that book, and it's kind of crazy that it took me this long to figure it out, is at the other important reason that almost all presidents have been forced to lie to the country is for the need to support white supremacy. Because white people are not superior, and yet Americans like their presidents to act as if they are and say that they are without exactly saying it. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up now as a result of the first conference is the discussion that was raised that there wasn't really much race in the new empire. And I don't recall there being much race in the Cold War book, but I haven't read it in a very
In the
long
later
time.
editions, there's more.
Yeah, so that's what I'm asking. And I'm wondering if we can, race is very important in American history. So I'm wondering if we can all pay attention to this, to the degree to which race enters Walt's oeuvre, if I might use that word, beginning with the new empire and through his career. My impression is it gets more and more important, and it's a fascinating bit of intellectual history. Frank, maybe it's important for your book.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
You know, I would suggest looking at his later book, if not last book, on the 1968 election. Is that right? Yeah.
I'm going to be speaking about that book.
Right.
At 3:30.
Okay. Well, that's my point. Is that is at the end of his career, and race is central in that book. So I think it gives us a good sense that even in his early work, it wasn't necessarily a major topic for himself or, frankly, for a lot of people in the field. And that later on, especially when we consider the implications of domestic politics, it becomes more and more important.
Yeah.
I have two comments, not a question. First goes to Eric's just comment about race. I think the evolution of Walt's scholarship dealing with race and other issues reflects the change in the historical profession. When Walt started out, questions like that didn't come up. Later in Walt's career, they did, so he addressed them as anybody would. So I think you see the evolution of a historian and the way he works in Walt. The other comment I wanted to make goes back to the influence of America, Russia, and the Cold War. It cements Walt's, in the first edition, cements Walt's reputation as a historian of the Cold War, and Walt then becomes the first New Left historian who's appointed to the Department of State's Advisory Committee on Historical Diplomatic Documentation, which oversees the compilation of foreign relations in the United States, which is the official publication of U.S. foreign relations. And it's because of Walt's reputation from America, Russia, and the Cold War that that appointment largely comes about. And I think that's a very important note.
Yeah, another point about race is that Walt was very sensitive to changes in American society. And when I TA'd for him last year was 1971, 72, he used in the course Arthur Coppett's book, Indians. Because there was now it's the main theme in American foreign relations history, the continuity between the displacement of the Indians and then American expansion overseas afterward. But there was very little literature on that back in the early 70s, and Walt used that play, Coppett's play, as something that would kind of bring attention to this problem in foreign relations history.
Frank, I want to ask you a question. If you want to think about for a moment, in the prior session, we spoke about Walt's empathy for the people that he was writing about. Do you think that he carried through the same level of empathy in America, Russia, and the Cold War in its various manifestations?
I don't know what he
I think
thinks.
he becomes even more empathetic towards the Soviet side,
Yeah.
or at least the post-Soviet side.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of love for Stalin in the book, but there is a recognition from the perspective of Putin that Russia has interests, and Gorbachev as well, that Russia has interests, including its own pride, And that is something that American policymakers need to be aware of, that they.
Well, one thing, my experience in grad school, the first semester, I had a seminar, just Bob Sedell and myself, we met at Walt and Sandy's house. I knew nothing, absolutely nothing. Somebody mentioned the name William Appleman Williams, I thought, why was his parent, it was a redundant name. I didn't know, I didn't know the significance of anything. But what struck me that the first few weeks is all the people I thought were heroes, my naive education, Franklin Roosevelt and John Kennedy, those were the bad guys. And all the people, the conservatives that, like Herbert Hoover and John Quincy Adams and people like that were the good guys. But I think in terms of your question, people who exercise some restraint, people who perhaps after reflection, I'm talking policymakers, who thought, well, maybe we should exercise more restraint, be more careful, be more cautious, those are the people who Walt tends to look favorably upon. And it's the people who rush into things without thought. And that's after all the thing about the new empire, right? That they thought about this empire they were building. And that thought is what is crucially important in how Walt assesses all kinds of things, including what happened in Cornell in 1968-69. Part of his objections, to jump in, part of his objections to the Barton Hall community, no offense, Richard, was that he felt that they weren't thinking through the possible consequences of what they were doing.
Hi, Andy Rotter. I'm a Cornell BA, 1975. You were talking about Walt's book being non-judgmental, Frank. Clearly a revisionist book, but still at least reserving judgment on the actions of individuals, behavior of individuals, motive of individuals. And you talked about Walt with reference to critics on the right or authors on the right and Gaddis. What about the left? Where was Walt in relation to, say, Alperovitz on atomic diplomacy or Gabriel Kolko, books that came out at roughly the same time?
I think Walt overall, and I have a lot of correspondence between Walt and Lloyd Gardner, with which they discussed this. Walt was generally sympathetic, certainly to Kolko, respected Kolko, and thought that Alperovitz's thesis was perhaps overstated about the reasons for the dropping of the atomic bomb, but basically had a good argument there. I also want to say that earlier there was a comment about did Walt regard himself as a new left historian? In that article that Walt wrote about Harrington in that Festschrift, Walt said that he describes Harrington, and I think he himself in a way, as not so much a new left historian, but as a Beardian historian. And I think one aspect of understanding Walt is that he was in but not of many categories. As I said, tried to say in my remarks, he transcended many things. And so you can't really pin Walt down. He didn't want to be pinned down in terms of some kind of like a simple category. So in terms of the left, I think he thought that was certainly admirable, but he wanted to be his own person.
And I had Tom McCormick as my advisor for graduate school, so I heard the stories from his perspective as well of those new left years. And he always made the point, and there seems to be some dispute about this in the historical record. He always made the point that McCormick himself made the point that he and Lloyd Gardner became Williams students, but that Walt remained a Harrington student, and that there was an important distinction there in terms of how much one wanted to self-identify with the new left.
I think that's true.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah. I mean, Walt's respect and admiration for Harrington, I think, surpassed that of almost anyone else.
Okay, another funny story. I did not see this firsthand, but I had a good friend who was in a seminar that she took, her senior year that Walt led, and Harrington came for a visit. And she described to me, I remember this clear as day, giggling about how you had never seen Professor Lefebvre become a 25-year-old until you saw him trying to teach a class with his own professor in the room. So it was really an insightful moment for me about generational shift.
And of course, the thing about lecturing with no notes, and Walt borrowed that from Harrington. I mean, there's a lot of continuity there.
Hi. John Fosek, PhD, around 1994. I had a question I wanted to ask, but this discussion of Harrington reminds me of a story. I was fortunate, probably thanks to Walt, to present the first paper I ever presented, and one of the only ones, at the conference in Madison, Rethinking the Cold War in Memory of William Appleman Williams. And there was a dinner hosted at the Chancellor's house. Donna Shalala came by at waist level and introduced herself to everybody sitting. But after the dinner, there was a circle gathered in this remarkable room. I think there was a fireplace. I don't know. I remember for late October in Madison was way colder than late October in Ithaca. But Harrington eulogized Williams, beginning by saying, "This is wrong." He should be eulogizing me. And Walt was standing behind the big chair that Harrington, this may be distorted in my memory, but my memory is that Walt was standing behind, and the way he gazed on Harrington, right, his importance to him, which I knew from conversations and things previously, was just so powerful. Just to reiterate what you're both saying.
So what was the word?
What?
It was so
It was so powerful,
Yeah.
and palpable. My question is, I wanted to ask both of you, especially in part, Jeff said when the book had run its course after the 2008 10th edition. What is your sense of its value or strengths and weaknesses today? And I ask this in part, because I'm on the faculty of an interdisciplinary international relations program, and I'm as engaged or more engaged in discourses and scholarship in international, transnational, global history as U.S. diplomatic history. And there's this vogue of talking about Cold War history in a very overdetermined way that I find problematic. And when Ode Arnie Westad's a great guy, great historian, but and his early work contributing to this is remarkable and important. But his Cold War, a global history, treating Cold War as really an overdetermined historical phenomenon, period, etc., is deeply disturbing to me personally. And in one of many roundtable discussions of that book that I've read,
of which book?
Of The Cold War, A Global History by Westad, Piero Iglesias, whose name I will never learn to pronounce, had a great intervention, and he's somebody who's puts race front and center and critique of American power and the disorder that it causes in the world, said, well, this is an important book, Westad's. People saying it's the greatest survey of the Cold War ever written are wrong. I stand by Lefebvre, America, Russia, and the Cold War. And I almost wrote him a fan letter when I read that. And I have not, I read and used in teaching that 10th edition when it was new. I keep pulling it off the shelf since I read Iglesias' remarks, saying I need to reread this, but I haven't managed it yet. So since you all have.
I think it's a great question. I think it's important to remember that, correct me if you disagree, that the book is largely written as an undergraduate textbook, an advanced undergraduate textbook, but as an undergraduate textbook. And so I tell my graduate students to read it in the same way that I tell them to read The American Age. That read in this book to find the things that are interesting to you so you can actually read deeply in them. And so in the sense of pulling it off the shelf, I find myself, too, pulling it off the shelf if I want to remind myself of the basics. But it's not designed as an in-depth study of any one particular moment. And I think that's both obviously its purpose, its utility, and in another sense, obviously, it was never meant to be anything more than that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's a great reference work. Yeah, and it has almost everything is in there. And also succinct. I mean, the way Walt's gift for expressing in pithy, as we all know from his lectures, pithy brilliance, right? Right.
And it's a work of synthesis. Westad, 5 times as long, is also a work of synthesis. And Westad, what Jesus was getting at is framing the Walt. And the argument in the synthesis that unifies it.
I'm going to exercise my prerogative as chair and weigh into the conversation. I'll tell very quickly my one Beard and one Gaddis story about Walt. The Beard story is, it must have been in the mid to late 90s. I saw Walt. I don't remember how it came up, but he asked if I had read Beard's critique of the U.S. entry into World War II, which I had to confess I had not. To my regret, I still have not. But he said very much the same thing that you were talking about with respect to Becker, that while Beard offered a powerful critique, what he missed was the necessity of U.S. involvement in World War II. And then when it comes to Gaddis, when I was on the job market, I shared with Walt a kind of sample syllabus I'd drawn up on, I think it was a seminar in the U.S. in the Cold War or something like that. And I had Gaddis on the syllabus, and I think he wrote back something to the effect of, I guess you have that in there under the category of know thy enemy. But of course, he said that with a good sense of humor because he had in fact assigned Gaddis to us in our Cold War seminar.
There's also Gaddis and there's Gaddis, right? Because I mean, the first book, Gaddis's first book, was published in 1973, won the Bancroft Prize, was actually quite middle of the road interpretation of the origins of the Cold War. By the time you get to We Now Know, it's much more extreme on the right.
Yeah, but I wanted to close by asking you to reflect upon a comment that you made about, or somebody made, about how, you know, when America, Russia, and the Cold War came out, there was still a kind of controversy surrounding the Wisconsin school and its, you know, alleged radicalism, even though there's quite actually a spectrum among the students who came out of Wisconsin, but that by the 10th edition, it had become conventional wisdom in some ways. And I was wondering if you could reflect on that transition and what Walt thought about it, if he did think about it, or how you see it in terms of the reception of that book over the years.
Well, I'm thinking, you were Schaefer last year, this past June?
I can't remember.
Okay, well, you're a young man. Anyway, okay, so there was at Schaefer, there was a well-attended session on with Daniel Immervar, you know, really top people, Ryan Irwin. Is expansion is expansion the proper, you know, focus for understanding American foreign relations history? And so they treated that as a question. You know, is there something else other than expansion? And because I'm biased, but there was nothing that people came up with. There was an alternative to expansion. So I think you could, so I mean, in terms of that being this kind of the key Wisconsin school insight, I think it's still very, of course now, you know, there's culture and there's other things that people, transnational history and so forth. But, you know, I think the expansion is still key.
If I may, you know, that was the conference where you got a big Lifetime Achievement Award, if I recall.
Yeah, one of them, yes.
I want everybody to know that. I always begin my lecture class talking about William Appleman Williams and laying out the reasons why William Appleman Williams got into so much trouble in the 1950s, and laying out several premises, you know, one of which was American foreign policy is at least in part driven by commercial interests. American foreign policy doesn't just happen to us, it's a thoughtful process. And then I say to the students, this in the 21st century, does anybody dispute any of those ideas? You know, and so the fact that it was controversial then, and the general thesis that American foreign policy is thoughtful, or at least thought through, is hard for people, I think, today to even understand why that would be a critique. But I think that's an important element of why the book has become so within the mainstream. If you want to think about the book on a spectrum, America, Russia, and the Cold War, you know, if it didn't change place, then American whole society moved, at least academically, to the left while it stood in the same place, which means that it moved to the left as well. No, moved to the right.
That's a very good note to close on, so thank you very much.
Well done, sir.
And we will reconvene in 10 minutes.
Good.